Hello, everybody. This is a revision of literary movements for the PG TRB exam and other exams. First, we will talk about the Augustans. As all of you know, the Augustans are the neoclassical writers, primarily of England. There were Augustans in the Augustan age of the age of Augustus Caesar, which was a very brilliant age in Rome. But to show that the neoclassical period is equally brilliant, the people of the 18th century were also called Augustans. The Augustan poets are famous for their long verse narratives or mock epics, which are often satirical, and they imitate neoclassical or classical models. That is why they are called neoclassical. They imitate classical models. They wrote long verse narratives or mock epics, often using satire. The Augustan era in English poetry is noted for its fondness for wit. The Augustan writers had a fondness for wit. Wit means brilliant dialogue, brilliant writing, fondness for urbanity, and for classical forms and values, mostly Roman. Fondness for wit, urbanity, and Roman classical values. The English Augustans both translated and modeled their own verse after poets such as Virgil, Horace, and Propertius. You know who they are? They were writers of the real Augustan age, the age of Augustus Caesar, which is Roman classicism. The Augustans were eventually overshadowed by the growth of English Romanticism. Listen, everybody, the Augustans wrote in the early 18th century. Towards the end of the 18th century, Romanticism came and our Augustans were overshadowed. They were replaced by the Romantics. Major practitioners were Pope, John Dryden, before Pope itself, John Dryden, then Alexander Pope, then John Gay, Jonathan Swift, Samuel Johnson. You have to remember all the major works of these writers, okay? Right. So that's a quick overview of the Augustans. Let us now talk about amatory fiction. It's a genre of British literature of the same age, 18th century, 17th, 18th century, approximately 1660. That means from Restoration to 1730. Many themes of the contemporary romance novel were first explored in amatory fiction. Romance novel originated in amatory fiction. As its name implies, amatory fiction is preoccupied with sexual love and romance, and mostly written by women. The works of amatory fiction were dominated by women, and they were written for female readers. The leading figures were Eliza Haywood, Della Riviere Manley, Aphra Behn. They were a trio of writers. All three were friends and major writers of late 17th, 18th centuries. Next, we'll talk about Beat Generation. It's a literary movement in the US, started by a group of authors whose works explored anti-capitalist ideas, anti-war ideas. They were of the post-war era, post-Second World War era, and they were very influential on American culture and politics. 1950s, it is the time of Beat Generation. The central elements of Beat culture. What are the central elements of Beat culture? Rejection of standard narrative values, making a spiritual quest, exploration of American and Eastern religions. These are all very standard themes that they employed. Narrative values were rejected. Traditional narrative values were rejected. Making a spiritual quest, exploration of American and Eastern religions. They were inspired by Zen Buddhism, Hinduism, and they rejected economic materialism. And also, they explicitly portrayed human condition, experimented with psychedelic drugs, sexual liberation, and exploration. These are all important elements of Beat Generation. Elements of the expanding Beat movement were incorporated into the emerging counterculture movements of this time. Many counterculture movements emerged at this time, such as hippie culture, yippie culture, bikers, and so on. And all of them were inspired by Beat Generation. Oops, sorry. I keep clicking wrongly. Sorry guys. Then significant figures include Herbert Hunk. Have you heard this name? Allen Ginsberg is very famous. William S. Burroughs, Lucien Carr, and Jack Kerouac. Which of the following writers was not a part of Beat Generation? Like that they will ask. So please remember these names. Black Mountain Poets are there. Have you heard of Black Mountain Poets? They were American poets. They were also called projectivist poets, a group of mid-20th century American avant-garde or postmodern writers. These writers were 20th century avant-garde postmodern writers centered on Black Mountain College in North Carolina. That is why they were called Black Mountain writers. Very important figure was Charles Olson. He published an essay, Projective Verse. In this, he called for a poetry of open field composition to replace traditional closed poetic forms. Traditional closed poetic forms were replaced with improvisation. Open field composition means experimentation that reflect the exact content of the poem. Key figures of Black Mountain Poets are Larry Eigner, Robert Duncan, Ed Norton. These are all not very famous, but very important is Charles Olson, Robert Creeley. Will you remember? These are very important writers. Dennis Levertov is also very famous. Now Bloomsbury Group, an informal group of friends, lovers. They lived in the Bloomsbury region of London in the early 20th century. They had a considerable liberalizing influence on British culture. They were influenced by G.E. Moore's Principia Ethica, very important book. And main figures were Clive Bell, E.M. Foster, Roger Fry. Roger Fry was a painter, an artist. Lytton Strachey, he was a biographer. Lytton Strachey wrote Eminent Victorians. Virginia Woolf, her husband Leonard Woolf, then John Maynard Keynes. He was an economist. Then Cavalier Poets. We are going in alphabetical order. A group of writers from 17th century in England, defined by their aristocratic beginnings. They are all aristocrats. They originated from the supporters of Charles I. The Cavaliers were the supporters of Charles I in the English Civil War. The Civil War was between Cavaliers and Roundheads, remember. These poets were the followers of Ben Jonson and may properly be called sons of Ben, while metaphysical poets were influenced by John Donne. Now, the lyrics of Cavalier poets are light, witty, elegant, concerned with love. They were not as revolutionary as the metaphysical poets. And the leading poets of the Cavalier group were Robert Herrick. Robert Herrick was both Cavalier and metaphysical. Then Richard Lovelace, John Suckling, Thomas Carew. Thomas Carew was also both Cavalier and metaphysical poet. Then there were some minor poets like Gondolphin and Randolph. We may not have heard this before. So those are Cavalier poets. Then concrete poetry. Concrete poetry is an arrangement of linguistic elements in which the typographical effect is more important in conveying meaning than verbal significance. Concrete poetry is arrangement of linguistic elements. Typographical effect is more important than conveying meaning. The presentation of the poem on the page using certain typographic peculiarities is more important. So it's also called visual poetry. Early examples are George Herbert's Easter Wings and The Altar, both included in his book The Temple. Also Robert Herrick's The Cross Tree Here. Post-war concrete poetry is there in the 1950s. Started in Brazil. Did you know that? And verbivoco visual. One new language was created in post-war concrete poetry. At this time, Augusto de Campos, Haroldo de Campos, etc. were significant figures in Brazil. Dark Romanticism, you might know, was an American movement which was against Transcendentalism. They emerged from Transcendentalism, but they were critical of Transcendentalism because Transcendentalists were very optimistic. Dark Romantics were very pessimistic. Dark Romantics focus on human fallibility, self-destruction, judgment, punishment, as well as psychological effects of guilt and sin, like in Moby Dick or Scarlet Letter. Sin, guilt. Significant figures are Edgar Allan Poe and Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville and Emily Dickinson. Now, Expressionism. It's a movement that originated in Northern Europe around the beginning of the 20th century. Emphasis on individual and subjective perspective. Expressionists gave importance to individualistic perspective. They were an avant-garde movement. It developed as a reaction to positivism and other artistic styles. Positivism was a movement that believed that human beings are in control of themselves and their environment. Expressionism shows that we are not in control of our mind. Expressionism in different ways reacted against naturalism and impressionism also. It was an avant-garde movement before the First World War. It remained afterwards during Weimar Republic and extended to various arts. Expressionistic architecture is there, painting is there, literature, dance, film, especially theatre and film. Expressionistic theatre and film. Remember, it began in Northern Europe, especially Germany. Expressionism was very important in Germany. Franz Kafka, German writers, all of them are, Alfred Doblin, Gottfried Benn, Heinrich Mann, Oskar Kokoschka, etc. are important figures. August Strindberg also. August Strindberg is also expressionist, as well as naturalist. Futurism is a 20th century Italian and Russian avant-garde movement. Futurism was there in Italy and Russia, promoted extreme artistic innovation and experimentation. Experimentation and innovation suitable to the technological age. A new view of art and technology it gave. The futurists strongly rejected self-awareness behind the overextended lyricism of symbolism and dominant school of the time. Italian futurism began with a manifesto of Filippo Marinetti, the Futurist Manifesto. It declared that artistic work without an aggressive element could not be considered a masterpiece. Aggression is there in Futurism. Filippo Marinetti, Mina Loy, Yaroslav Seifert are important figures. Okay? Then, Harlem Renaissance, an intellectual and artistic movement of African Americans in the 1920s and 30s, flourished near New York City. They sought to break free of Victorian moral values and bourgeois shame about aspects of their life that might reinforce racist beliefs. So they were against Victorian morality, Victorian values that reinforced racism. The movement laid the groundwork for all later African American literature and had an enormous impact on subsequent black literature and consciousness worldwide. It influenced black literature worldwide. Key figures were Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston. Jindyworobak Movement. I was going to mispronounce it. Jindyworobak Movement is an Australian literary movement. It is indigenous Australian movement of the 1930s and 40s. There were white members also. They wanted to show that Australian culture is an integration. True Australian culture is an integration of indigenous Australian subjects, language and mythology. They were influenced by the bush ballad tradition. Remember, A.B. Patterson and such bush poets influenced the Jindyworobak movement. It began in Adelaide in South Australia, and important figures were Rex Ingemells. He founded the Jindyworobak Club. And there is a famous lecture that he gave entitled On Environmental Values. Jindyworobak comes from Woiwurrung language. It is an indigenous language more spoken formerly in Melbourne. And that language was used by James Devaney in his 1929 book, The Vanished Tribes. Significant members were Nancy Cato, Norma Davis, and Rex Ingemels. Lake Poets was a group of English writers of Lake District. As you know, they are the Romantic poets of the first half of the 20th century. The name Lake Poets was given by Francis Jeffrey, a Scottish literary critic, and it was initially a derogatory term created by the Edinburgh Review, a school of whining, hypochondriacal poets, said Francis Jeffrey, attacking the Lake Poets. Then, lost generation. A term used to refer to, I forgot to mention, the Lake Poets are Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Southey. Lost generation is a term used to refer to American expatriate writers living in Paris. They were not living in America after the First World War, that is during the 1920s. Gertrude Stein is credited with coining the term, and it was popularized by Ernest Hemingway when he made that sentence that Gertrude Stein said. He made it the epigraph of his first novel, 1926 novel, The Sun Also Rises. What is the epigraph? You are all a lost generation. The lost generation made an impact on society because the writings that came out of this period showed the effects of war on people. Lost generation, generally they wrote about war, they wrote about the upper classes, they wrote about people affected by the First World War. The major writers of Lost Generation were F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, Ezra Pound, Waldo Pierce, have you heard of him? John Dos Passos, who wrote USA Trilogy. F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote Great Gatsby, as you know. Even James Joyce, T.S. Eliot were also part of Lost Generation, E.E. Cummings, etc. Then we have magic realism, a narrative strategy of the postmodern period that emerged in Latin America, characterized by matter-of-fact inclusion of fantastic or mythical elements into realistic fiction. What appears like realism is infused with mythical or fantastic elements. The term magic realism was introduced by Franz Roh. They can ask you this question. It was a German art critic. Roh coined the term and used it to create an art category that strayed from the strict guidelines of realism. But the term did not name an artistic movement. Magic realism was not an artistic movement until the 1940s in Latin America and the Caribbean. Notable figures include Isabel Allende, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. They were both Latin American writers. Toni Morrison, Ben Okri, Salman Rushdie, and Alejo Carpentier. Metaphysical poets next. The term was coined by Samuel Johnson to describe a loose group of 17th century English poets whose work was characterized by the inventive use of conceits, metaphysical conceits, as against Petrarchan conceits, by a greater emphasis on the spoken rather than the lyrical quality of verse. As I already told you, they were all inspired by John Donne. Themes include love, religion, morality, and the metaphysical poets explored these themes through unusual comparisons, syllogism, wit, and such shocking elements also. Conversational style. The leading metaphysical poets were John Donne, George Herbert, Andrew Marvell, Abraham Cowley, Richard Crashaw, Henry Vaughan. Misty Poets, have you heard? A group of 20th century Chinese poets who reacted against the restrictions on art during the Cultural Revolution. Their work was very hazy or obscure, so they were called Misty Poets. Chinese poets, remember. Naturalism is a literary movement that began in late 19th century. They can ask you to chronologically arrange these movements And this was an offshoot of realism. Naturalism was an offshoot of realism, characterized by determinism, detachment, scientific objectivism, and social commentary. Traces, the origins trace to the theories of Émile Zola and Auguste Comte's positivism. They are important works of naturalism. Proponents of this movement believe heredity and environment control people. People are controlled by heredity and environment, and people are products of their environment. Important figures include Émile Zola, Stephen Crane, Gade Maupassant, Theodore Dreiser, and Aloisio Azevedo. Nouveau Roman means new novel or anti-novel, flourished in about 1955 to 70. It is a French avant-garde movement. They have asked Nouveau Roman in some exams recently. Alain Robe Grillet is an important figure. Nouveau Roman is anti-novel, so it rejected traditional elements of the novel. Did you get me? Rejected traditional elements of the novel such as plot and character in favor of neutrally recording the experience of sensations and things. Then there is Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, a group of English painters, poets, and art critics. They were all both painters and poets. They were also art critics. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, or PRB, was founded in 1848 by the important figures William Holman Hunt, John Everett Millais, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, his brother William Michael Rossetti, James Collinson. He left the group after some time. F.G. Stephens, Thomas Woolner. Remember these names? They formed a 7-member brotherhood, in part on the Nazarene movement. The Pre-Raphaelites defined themselves as a reform movement. They wanted to reform art. They wanted to avoid the influence of neoclassical art. They wanted to avoid the influence of Renaissance and neoclassical art, and they wanted to revive the truthfulness and spirit of devotion of medieval art. The Germ was their periodical. Then Realism originated with the realist movement in France. Stendhal, Balzac, Flaubert, very important figures. Also in Russian literature, Pushkin. Pushkin was a transition from Romanticism to Realism. Then after that, Turgenev, Dostoevsky. Then there was Tolstoy, very important, realists in Russia. All in the 19th century. Realist movement began in painting also in the 1850s. The realist painters rejected Romanticism because Romanticism was dominating at this time. Subgenres of realism are social realism. Social realism was written by Dickens. Socialist realism flourished in Russia, Maxim Gorky. Naturalism of Émile Zola. There are naturalists in America, such as Stephen Crane, Frank Norris, Theodore Dreiser. So I have given important names here: Gustave Flaubert, Honoré de Balzac, Leo Tolstoy, George Eliot, and Charles Dickens. Romanticism next. The movement was rooted in the German Sturm und Drang movement, or storm and stress movement. It was a movement of extreme emotionalism, and it preferred intuition and imagination and emotion to the rationalism of enlightenment. You know, I will explain. At first, there was enlightenment that gave importance to reason, and then Sturm und Drang movement gave importance to emotion, intuition, and imagination. So Romanticism was influenced by all this. The significance to Romanticism of childhood innocence. What are the main themes of Romanticism? Childhood innocence, imagination, racial theories. All gave importance to folk literature, non-classical mythology, children's literature. Especially German Romanticism was very influential. The key figures were William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, John Keats, Lord Byron, P.B. Shelley, and William Blake. Have you heard of spoken word poetry? Spoken word refers to oral poetic performance based on not only the text of the poem but also on the performer's aesthetic qualities. Spoken word poetry is a late 20th century continuation of ancient oral artistic traditions. Performers' live intonation, voice inflection are very important in spoken word poetry. Poetry is recited aloud, including poetry readings, poetry slams, jazz poetry, hip hop music. All these are very important. Laurie Anderson, Hedwig Gorski. These names they won't ask in PGTRB, but spoken word might be important. Now, Sturm and Drang movement, translated as storm and stress. It was a proto-romantic movement, as I told you. The term was applied to works filled with rousing action and high emotionalism, often dealing with an individual rebelling against the injustices of society. Sturm und Drang originated from Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther. Another major proponent was the dramatist and novelist Friedrich von Klinger. Johann Goethe, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Friedrich Schiller and Johann Merck were important figures. Then symbolism, as everybody knows, is a 19th century movement, artistic and literary movement. Originated in France in the late 19th century, spread to painting and theatre. It originated in poetry, spread to painting and theatre, and influenced American and European literatures. Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville are symbolists. In Europe also there were symbolists like Charles Baudelaire, Verlaine, Mallarmé. And in England there were people like W.B. Yeats. So it all started with the 1857 publication of Baudelaire's Fleurs du Mal, or Flowers of Evil. Stéphane Mallarmé, Paul Verlaine, Arthur Rimbaud, Jules Laforge, very important figures. Theatre of the Oppressed originated in 1970s in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, founded by Augusto Boal, important figure. It is a community-based theatre that strives to inspire social change. Theatre of the Oppressed. The theatre was influenced by slum dwellers and life in slums. You know, it was influenced by Boal's concepts about society, critical reflection, dialogue, process of liberation of poor people, oppressed people, etc. Then Transcendentalism. Transcendentalism is a philosophical movement of the 1820s, 30s. Remember, in 1836, Emerson wrote Nature. Transcendentalism emphasizes subjective intuition over objective empiricism. Emerged from England and German Romanticism, influenced by biblical criticism of Herder and Schleiermacher. They were German romantics. They were also influenced by the skepticism of David Hume and the transcendental philosophy of Immanuel Kant and German idealism. Very important figures, Perry Miller and Arthur Versluis, regard Emanuel Swedenborg. Do you know Emanuel Swedenborg? He influenced William Blake. Jacob Boehme, very important people. And they all influenced Transcendentalism. Key figures, all these questions will be there in NET and SET also, okay? Key figures include Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Margaret Fuller, and Amos Bronson Alcott. So with that, we come to the end of this introduction to literary movements. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you.